Welcome, my name is Brooklin Myers. I'm the Elixir instructor at Dockyard Academy. I'm also the host of the Elixir Newbie podcast, and if it's not very apparent at this point, this is my first time at ElixirConf. So I want to give a huge thank you, and we're working out the bugs on this one. Thanks so much. That'll be the first and last time we hear that. Okay. So a little bit of context on why I'm up here and why I'm talking. I've already told you I'm the Elixir instructor at Dockyard Academy. Dockyard Academy is an educational effort started by Dockyard. Our goal is to expand the Elixir community and make more qualified Elixir developers. We're going to do that through a 90-day course, which we're working on launching. And right now, for the past 8 months, I have been working on a completely free and open source curriculum with Livebook. And that's why I'm going to be talking about using Livebook to teach Elixir. So before we go too deep into this topic, I just want to make sure everyone here, I think at this point, everyone in this room at the very least has heard about Livebook, but for those who might be watching on YouTube or watching the video later, just want to make sure it's clear. So Livebook is a code notebook. It combines Markdown with executable Elixir code cells, as well as a bunch of other tools that you can incorporate to make these really powerful and engaging notebooks. It's commonly used for prototyping. I use it for teaching. It has a ton of applications and use cases. So my suspicion is that everyone here has something that they're going to be able to use Livebook for. I want to talk about using Livebook to teach Elixir. I want to make sure that's not exclusionary. So when I talk about teaching, I don't only mean within the context of a course or a curriculum. I'm talking about the kind of teaching that we do every single day as developers. When we are talking to a coworker and we're explaining some concept, when we have a junior developer and we're trying to help them onboard onto our team, everyone here is also a teacher. So I'm going to be highlighting some of the use cases that are going to be common to everyone. Whew, okay. So I have 4 goals for this talk. The first is I want to empower everyone here to use Livebook as a teaching tool. So nowadays, whenever I have to explain some concept, maybe a developer asks about immutability or asks about some operator or just needs an explanation, Livebook more and more is becoming an IEX replacement for me. So anytime I need to write up a quick explanation, I'll just pop up a Livebook and have the ability to walk them through it. It's also fantastic for creating educational notebooks. So again, that doesn't have to be creating a curriculum similar to what I'm doing. That can be creating material for onboarding your developers. It can be documenting your project with visuals. It can even be creating notebooks for non-developer types to help them gain insight into your system. I'm also going to talk about how to create Livebook tools. So projects like Kino have empowered us to extend the core functionality of Livebook beyond what it is just out of the box capable of. And so if you want to make custom tools that allow you to extend that functionality, you are powered in a ton of really incredible ways. So I'm hoping that people will walk out of this talk inspired to create something on their own and extend the community. So all of this is hopefully going to be broadly applicable and useful to everyone here. My last thing that I want to talk about is going to be the shortest and the most specific. So I do have some things I want to talk about that are related to managing large Livebooks. So if you have a large collection of Livebook notebooks, there are some tips and tricks that I've learned that make that a lot easier, so I'm also going to talk about that. Okay, so using Livebook as a live teaching tool, as I mentioned before, more and more, rather than popping into the IX shell, I will run Livebook and walk through explanations with people, either sharing my screen or creating some kind of code collaboration. So if you're not already using Livebook on your teams, I highly recommend using it as a just a code scratchpad. Whenever you're working with your coworkers and you want to talk something out and you want to get some code involved, having the ability to have multiple different cells of execution, having the ability to write down the takeaways within Markdown, it's incredibly powerful, and everyone here can be leveraging it. You also have the ability to save and persist your learning. So one of the common problems that occurs on teams is capturing knowledge. We have to have conversations with each other. A lot of knowledge tends to be centered on one developer. And so having the ability to have that conversation, use Livebook as your collaborative teaching tool, and then just saving it for future use, having a notebooks folder on your application. So if you want to document how to work with your project, or there's a common question that people keep asking, now you have documentation to refer to that's really interactive. And that's saved in a .livemd file that you can just have a folder on in your project. Livebook has also come out with the ability to, we were always able to install dependencies, but they've made it a lot easier using a graphical interface. So now there is a search system for finding projects within the Elixir ecosystem. So if you wanted to, say, run a benchmark on some code that you were working on, you have the ability to just really quickly install that in your project and use some kind of external dependency. So you just include that in the setup section of your Livebook, and it's super, super fast if you just want to get started with things. Maybe you want to explore your project, you want to try out some new library, just get really quickly interactive with it, rather than starting up a whole new project or adding it to your existing project, which can be cumbersome. You have the ability to just do that within a Livebook. One of the common ways of running Livebook is connecting your project directly using the runtime. So by default, it's just going to be using Elixir standalone, kind of the core Elixir. But if you want, you can connect it to another project and have access to all of the modules that are part of that project. Now, I think that's one of the more common ways of running it, but I've actually run into a lot of problems with that. And one of the problems is that once you've connected your project, it's not easy to install additional dependencies. And so if you want to add, let's say, Livebook specific dependencies that you don't want to include in your mixed project, or you can even install multiple different mixed projects using this, what I found to be better than just changing the runtime for most use cases is to instead install the project using the path, and that way you can also install additional dependencies. One issue we ran into at Dockyard Academy was once we started having students join in and run Livebook in different ways. So Livebook Desktop recently came out. There's lots of different ways of running Livebook, and the path inside of Livebook, I've seen a few people on the Livebook Slack experience this issue. The path on Livebook will be dependent on how you're running the program. And so if you're installing a project using path, you can have that crash depending on how you're running it. So the most consistent experience has been using the directory of the Livebook in order to install the project, and that way you can just ensure a really consistent experience across developers. Okay, so I'm sure there are lots of people using Livebook to prototype, to build, to just play around with the code, but I'm not sure how many people in this room will actually be creating educational Livebook notebooks. So one of the things I'm hoping to do is to inspire people to realize that they have a use case there, that it is not just for prototyping or working with embedded systems, or it is something that we can use to improve the community and share knowledge. That can be with a wider scope, of course, within the community, but that can also be internally on your teams. Kino, if you are considering working with any kind of Livebooks and you're actually interested in not just quick notepads, but you want to extend the functionality and create these really awesome, engaging notebooks, Kino allows you to extend the core features provided by Livebook. So we're able to do things like providing graphs and more visual information. It allows us to make our notebooks more than just very small text information. It doesn't need to feel like reading Erlang documentation. It can feel like we're reading something engaging and visual. It also reduces, I'm sure some people have had this experience where they're going through hex docs, they're learning about some concept. It's very easy to trick yourself into thinking that you actually understand what you're reading. Because you look at the evaluation, you look at the code written, and you go, yeah, okay, like I get it. But within a Livebook, you're actually executing the code. And so it forces people to be hands-on. One of the things I recently heard about that I thought was interesting was that some of the training that was done at this conference was done using Livebook. And rather than just having the code run, you actually had to take the code over from like a markdown cell or maybe a different Livebook, copy that in, and then run it. And that created this barrier to just skimming over the code where you actually had to get engaged with it. And I think that's the goal of a lot of our documentation, is to make it so that people can't just skim, they actually have to work through and understand the concepts. We also have the ability to do tables. So if you want to, say, connect to your database, display some information, provide it in a way that is highly visual, we have the ability to do stuff like that. Diagrams has been awesome. So if you don't already know about Mermaid, we have the ability, this is not actually a feature within Kino. This is something that is just core to Livebook. And so we have the ability to write this text representation of a UML-style diagram, and it will just auto-display and generate inside of your Livebook. So rather than going to some UML program, downloading the image, having kind of the flow of that, you can just write them directly from within your Livebook. So highly, highly recommend. The documentation for Mermaid is fantastic. If you want to talk about, say, you're making documentation within your project and you want to have a visual representation of like, hey, here's the parts of our system, here's how they work. It's just a really, really fast way to be able to keep that up to date. It's really lightweight, so you don't have to go in, edit the image, redistribute it. You can just go in directly to the Livebook and manipulate it. And there's tons more. I don't have time in this talk to cover all of the amazing things that you can do. But there are things like animations. Of course, we include images. Something that I don't know if a lot of people know about is we can actually embed YouTube content. So there's a project called Kino Lab, which is pioneered by Jonathan Klosko. I'm hoping I said his name right. And he made a Kino.YouTube component, which I think is fairly experimental, but so far for me has been working fantastically. So if you want to include some video content inside of your Livebook, again, let's say you're using it for onboarding, and you want to include some links to some really, really relevant and fantastic YouTube videos, you have the ability to do that. If you are creating larger Livebooks and you want to include links, you have the ability to link Livebooks one to the other. I'm going to show some kind of cool use cases for that. And something I haven't seen popularized or talk about yet is ETS visualizations. So automatically, if you include Kino inside of your Livebook, it will have the ability to, if you have an ETS process, an ETS table, it will display that table in like an actual table, a markdown style table format, and you can just refresh it every time you're manipulating that process, and that way you're able to kind of have this really visual way of understanding how your system works. One of the coolest recent developments is supervision tree visualizations, so huge thank you to ElixirConf for making that possible. That was unfortunately the demo that I had prepared, so I'll talk about it a little bit here, is you're able to combine animations as well as there's a Kino.process module, which is responsible for rendering a supervision tree. So you give it a supervisor, it renders out that same mermaid-style diagram, and it's a great way if you want to just visualize, like, hey, like, how does the process work in my application? What are the processes under the supervisors? Like, if you want to give people that representation, just does it all automatically for you. And you can combine that if you want to get really playful with it and have some fun. You can combine that with animations to live visualize your supervisor and be able to monitor your system. I'm not going to say real time, but essentially polling, where every second you're going to get a new display. So you're able to, let's say you had a dynamic, excuse me, let's say you had a dynamic supervisor, starting processes under it. I swear this is going to be so cool to actually see this visually. Like I promise it was going to be awesome, but you'll just have to believe me. And so this is, it allows us to, everyone has different ways of learning, and some people need that visual representation of a system. So making it so that people who want that representation can have it, it just really empowers people to understand systems better and quicker. Another thing that's been awesome is you have the ability to import Livebooks into your, import Livebook notebooks into your Livebook. So any Livebook that is publicly available, you can grab the URL of it, import it into your Livebook, and then run and execute the code. And so that has made it much easier to be able to share these notebooks with people. You can also set up a Livebook badge. So this has already been talked about a lot, but I still see a lot of libraries, excuse me. I still see a lot of libraries in the Elixir community not yet implementing this. It's something that I would also love to see this being implemented in, if you're an Elixir content creator and you're writing content, my guess is you're probably using something like Markdown, so it's not much of a stretch to convert that into Livebook and then just have it so that as a companion to your article, include this link at the top or the bottom, or include the badge, and then anyone can execute your code. So I've been using this for the Elixir newbie website, if you want an example of that, and that's a great way, I think, to improve the quality of the content that we're sharing in our community. This is super recent. This is, I think, happened in the last week, so I did want to give a spotlight and a shout out to Notes Club, which is a new website for sharing Livebooks. My understanding is it automatically goes through GitHub, finds Livebook notebooks, and then has them all displayed. So my hope for the site, it is very, very early days. This was just launched by Hector Perez. My hope for the site is that it will help us share these learning resources with each other. Right now, it's very limited. It's open to contributions. I think it still doesn't yet have search. So I know that that's like a feature being worked on. So I would love to see people contribute to that. Love to see that grow. Okay, so if you're not an educator, if you're not someone who wants to actually create these Livebooks, or if you're not someone who necessarily wants to be using this as a teaching tool, but you're a builder, right? Or maybe you are all those other things, but you're also a builder. There are a ton of tools yet to be built within the Livebook ecosystem. And so we can do that using a few things, for the most part provided by Kino. So there's two components, Kino.js and Kino.js Live. Live just means we have the ability to have some interactivity. And my mental model for the category of problems that these solve is essentially we can take any Elixir code and output some kind of a user interface. So anytime you think to yourself, man, I would really love to have this visual information inside of my Livebook, Kino.js, Kino.js Live, that's going to be the tool that you reach for. So I've used this within the Academy to create a smart animation player. And the goal of this was to make it so that the animations by default will just kind of run in Livebook. And I wanted to give students the ability to have some more control. So it takes a list of frames that we're going to display as part of the animation, and then it renders this user interface where the student can go through the next frame. This is a open source project, so if you're interested in using this, it's just right now under my GitHub, Brooklin Jazz, under Smart Animation, which isn't a very smart name for it, if I'm going to be completely honest. I thought I was going to use smart cells. I really did. I was quite certain. So when I mixed nude up this project and started working on it, I was wrong. It turned out you can just do this with Kino.js. You're just rendering a UI. So that was a good learning. Now, I hinted at it, smart cells. So smart cells, I think there's maybe some confusion about how these work. I know I was definitely, when I heard about it, I'm like, wow, these are being used in all these really creative and interesting ways. I don't know what they do or how to use them, and I'm afraid of things that are new, so I'm just going to ignore them for a little while until we had a use case for them where what we wanted to do was be able to selectively hide content for our students. This essentially solves the opposite problem, where instead of having some Elixir code generate a user interface, I want some kind of user interface that's going to generate some Elixir code. And so that really demystified smart cells for me. So we wanted to hide certain code from students. Maybe we want to display something like some data. Here we have a comparison of Big O performance. Maybe in your Livebooks you want to render something, but you don't want to show the code that was used to actually render it. This uses some hidden just HTML and JavaScript inputs. It communicates with the Keynote.js Live module, and it's able to render without actually showing any of the code. This, applying kind of a similar process, this was a massive thing for Dockyard Academy where we were thinking, how do we have a good testing system from within Livebook? Within Livebook, you have the ability to start up your XUnit tests. You just manually start them instead of having it kind of automatically started for you. But you don't really want to overwhelm students with this massive amount of tests that might include concepts they're not ready for. And so we realized we could use smart cells to build this. At first, we were doing something that frankly was it was a first pass. Our first solution is often not the best. I'm sure we're all very familiar with that. And so what it was doing was it would call a function under the hood in a utility project, run the tests, and then return the output and display them. And the problem with that was now you have a function call that's visible to students. You have issues where if they edit it, now it's manipulatable. And so that's what we use to solve this problem. It also allows us to provide feedback and hints so we can track how many times is the student evaluating this exercise? Are they repeatedly having difficulties? And so we're able to provide some feedback in the form of a solution using these cells. By the way, I know that the interface, it's not the prettiest thing I've ever built, but it's for me. It's for me as the teacher. I would love contributions to this project, by the way. If this is something that other people want to use and it becomes something that people are interested in for creating exercises within Livebook, I'm more than happy to help out and keep expanding its feature set. So this is what it returns. Student has the code cell where they're able to provide the solution for their exercise. We have our test results, any warnings and error messages, and that code will continue to be accessible throughout the Livebook. It's not just running within its own little isolated environment. So if they define variables, they can access those and continue to use them throughout the Livebook. So if you have like layered exercises, you want to have access to any of the modules defined. And to avoid frustration, they're banging their head against the wall. Maybe whoever's the instructor in this case, I'll say myself, is busy and can't help out, or it's just better to kind of get some early feedback to prevent them from continuously struggling. We can display a possible solution, which if they're strong-willed, they have the ability to hide. Okay. So we're coming to the last part of the talk. This is managing large Livebooks. This is more specific to if you're in a use case where you want to have many, many notebooks and you want some tips for how do I manage these effectively. First thing is use an index. So as mentioned, Livebooks have the ability to link to each other. So if you have the relative path of another Livebook within the project, you have the ability to have these kind of hyperlinks between Livebooks. And we've been using that in some ways that I'll show here. And so having this main file, the name of it doesn't matter, but it's becoming kind of common to call it index.livemd so that students, or I shouldn't say students, anyone using your Livebook has the ability to navigate your project, see all of the Livebooks involved, and doesn't have to go back and forth between the Livebook and the file system. So the persistence mechanism for Livebook is live MD files, live Markdown. It's just text. And that doesn't sound cool when you first say it, but it's really awesome. It solves a whole class of problems, and it makes it so that we can work with these the same way that we would any text file. So if you're working with a large project and you want to automate tasks, for example, I was talking to a friend and coworker the other day. He was telling me about Jupyter Notebooks. So I think that's kind of the Python equivalent. And I have never used that program, so if I say wrong things, it's his fault. And so they use JSON for their persistence mechanism. So if you want to manipulate it, now you need to understand, well, how are they storing this? How are they working with this? For us, it's just essentially Markdown with a little bit of extra stuff. And so if you want to write scripts, you have the ability to manipulate these, read all of your notebooks, work with them with regular expressions, and manipulate them. So we've used this for a couple of big use cases. One was automating adding in Git commit sections. So after students complete an exercise or a reading, we have a section that will automatically take the title of the Livebook and give them some instructions so that they can save their progress. And one of the big things I found when I was talking in the community and talking to other people who had graduated similar boot camps was a lot of people not feeling comfort with Git. And so it was really important for us to make sure that they get daily and regular practice with it. Another thing, this was very, very, if you run a large Livebook project, I guarantee that you're going to run into this issue. Navigation is kind of clunky when you have a lot of Livebooks, because you're going to jump into one Livebook, read down to the bottom, and then if you're a new dev, for most people, okay, I'll just go back, I'll figure it out, or I'll scroll up, or whatever I'll do. But if you're new dev, it's kind of confusing as you're reading it. And so we wanted to add a navigation system. And so we're able to use scripts to accomplish that, where because we have links, we have the ability to just let students continue reading through the exercises and the material, and it just makes this really clean, convenient interface for them. We use this for a lot of other stuff too. I wanted to show kind of the coolest examples, but I'm sure you can imagine using this for things like formatting, error checking, spell checking, which if you ever look at the issue tracker on DocArt Academy, I'm very grateful to the people who catch my mistakes. I'm a programmer, not a, well, I guess I can't use that excuse. I am a writer, but I make mistakes. Okay, so my hope is that you are walking away from this with more of an understanding of what you can use Livebook for. You're excited about some of the use cases. I think that everyone here can adopt Livebook as a tool that they use whenever they're working with other developers, especially if they're working with new developers, as a way to share knowledge and save knowledge. I'm also hoping that all of you are excited to build things with Livebook, whether it's educational material, whether it's tooling, whether it's documentation for your system, whether you want to build, I think a lot of non-developer tools could be built using Livebook now that we have the ability to run Livebook in Livebook Desktop. So I'm hoping you're all excited, hoping this sparks the beginning of the next awesome Livebook project. And I want to say thank you.